In the early 20th century, a fleet of white-painted Portuguese fishing vessels crossed the Atlantic each year to fish off the coast of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Known as the White Fleet for their distinctive color, these ships were part of a seasonal migration that shaped the lives of thousands of men and connected two continents through a shared fishing economy. Today, the story of the White Fleet is often overlooked, yet it speaks volumes about labor, migration, and the links between Portugal and Canada. The roots of the White Fleet go back centuries. Portuguese fishermen had been sailing to the Grand Banks since at least the 16th century, following the cod-rich waters off Newfoundland and Labrador. These fishing grounds were among the most productive in the world, and European powers competed for access. Portugal maintained a strong presence, particularly from ports like Aveiro, Lisbon, and especially St. John's twin city, St. John's da Terceira in the Azores. Over time, this seasonal fishing pattern turned into a dependable tradition. By the early 1900s, the White Fleet had become a regular sight in Canadian ports. The fleet consisted of tall ships, often four-masted schooners, painted white to reflect sunlight and keep the hold cooler. These ships carried dories, small wooden boats used for fishing far from the mothership. Crews would launch the dories early in the morning, spend long hours hauling in cod, and then return in the evening to unload and salt the catch. This method was slow, dangerous, and physically demanding. Fog, high seas, and sudden storms posed constant risks. Fishermen sometimes got lost or drowned. Yet despite the harsh conditions, this seasonal work was a steady source of income for coastal Portuguese communities with limited local opportunities. Every summer, the fleet would anchor off the coast of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. Portuguese sailors became a familiar presence in towns like St. John's, St. Pierre's, and Halifax. While the crews generally lived and worked aboard their ships, they came ashore to resupply, attend mass, and occasionally find medical care. Local residents, especially those of Portuguese or Catholic backgrounds, often welcomed them. Bonds formed across cultures, and these annual visits created a unique rhythm for both the fishermen and the towns they visited. The White Fleet represented a mix of tradition and necessity. Portugal in the early 20th century was struggling with poverty, limited industrialization, and high rates of immigration. The cod fisheries offered work, even if it was difficult and dangerous. Meanwhile, Canadian authorities and businesses tolerated or even encouraged the Portuguese presence, as the cod trade was economically important to the region. Despite their regular presence, the White Fleet's activities were largely isolated from Canadian life. Language barriers, cultural distance, and the temporary nature of the visits kept the sailors on the margins. These men came to work, not to settle. Still, their annual arrivals created a sense of continuity, and they were seen as part of the larger story of Atlantic life. World War II and the changes that followed eventually brought an end to the White Fleet. Advances in refrigeration, engine power, and fishing technology made the old dory-based method obsolete. Governments tightened maritime regulations, and the international fish market shifted. By the 1970s, the White Fleet had disappeared from North American waters. Its legacy, however, lingers. In St. John's, Newfoundland, a monument honors the Portuguese sailors who died at sea. There are small museums and plaques in Nova Scotia and Portugal that commemorate the fleet's presence. For the families of those who worked the dories, the memory of the White Fleet is passed down in stories of danger, endurance, and connection to the sea. Additionally, far removed from the fishing grounds of the Grand Banks, there can be found another monument of sorts. On the banks of the Delaware River in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, one can find a three-masted sailing vessel named Gazela Primero. This Portuguese-built barkentine was part of the White Fleet and fished for cod on the Grand Banks for over 50 years, until it found a new home in Philadelphia as a sail training ship in the mid-1970s. The White Fleet's story is also part of a broader narrative about Atlantic migration and labor. These were not heroic adventurers, but working men driven by economic need. They followed a route that, for generations, defined their communities and shaped their identities. The fleet is also a reminder of how geography and resources bring people together, not always through shared ideals, but through shared labor. In an age where global connections are often discussed in terms of digital networks and trade agreements, it's worth remembering how physical movement of ships, goods, and people built relationships across oceans. The Portuguese White Fleet was part of this history. It carried not just cod, but culture and memory. Its disappearance marks a shift, not only in fishing methods, but in the ways people relate to the sea and to each other across borders. Industrial fishing replaced the wooden schooners. Migration took on different forms. The rhythm of the White Fleet is gone, but the traces it's left, on both sides of the Atlantic, remain. In the end, the story of the Portuguese White Fleet is simple. Men set sail to work, endured hardship, and returned home. What they built in the process, through presence, repetition, and shared space, was a quiet connection between two distant shores.